So you've written this open letter to the government. You're calling for JobKeeper to be extended to all workers. Which workers are missing out at the moment?
Thanks, Tom. Good afternoon. Look, this is a critical moment in time for the federal government as it recalibrates this JobKeeper arrangement. We've got an industry here which is crippled, and it's not any industry, Tom, as we all know. It is the gateway to the global community, and it is the gateway to ensuring that our domestic economy is ready to fire when these restrictions are removed. And what we have in aviation is a terrible mix. We've got a September 27 cliff at the moment, which means that companies can't prepare to make sure that aviation is ready to go again. Think of the delicate situation, Tom, that Virgin is in at the moment as it works its way through administration. And we have thousands of Australian families who've been denied JobKeeper simply because of a quirk of the system, which says that if a particular company is owned by a foreign government, then JobKeeper is not available. And that has denied nearly 6,000 Australian families access to the scheme. So we're saying, with the help of these 16 parties in this open letter to the Prime Minister, that the time has come to extend JobKeeper beyond September, to extend JobKeeper to all aviation companies, and to make sure that it only phases out when the virus phases out itself.
Well, just on the phase-out, though, don't we need to assess a new normal? I mean, the government's clearly going to extend assistance to a lot of industries, at least for a few months. But do airlines need to figure out, OK, under these business conditions, perhaps, sure, open up internal borders, maybe a travel hub, and then figure out how big the airline can be, rather than this whenever the virus clears internationally? And you could be talking about years and years until that happens.
Well, we could be talking about a long period of time, but this is one industry where the government needs to show and continue to show leadership. Tom, we don't quibble that the federal government showed great leadership when it changed its mind back in March and put in place a JobKeeper arrangement. It has been very important for the Australian economy. Some workers, such as those in many aviation companies, have missed out. Their families are on the precipice of disaster, financial disaster, and this sector will be in disaster mode if it doesn't have the certainty of a scheme that does continue until borders open again. Because what is necessary for the Australian economy, not just for aviation workers and the aviation sector, is that the aviation sector is ready to go again as the virus lifts and as the restrictions lift. Because domestically, that will mean our domestic economy can move, Tom, and internationally, yes, it could be a fair amount of time, but it needs to be ready. Otherwise, we're not going to be ready to reconnect with the world.
Right, but I mean, isn't that the issue again internationally? So you could have workers for 3, 4, 5 years literally doing nothing, getting paid a wage subsidy for all that time. It just doesn't seem sustainable. What would the workers do during that time? If they're getting a wage subsidy of some sort, if they're getting JobKeeper and the international arm is not operating at all, what would they do? Would they just sit at home and collect the money?
Well, I mean, let's be a bit clear about this. I don't think there's a suggestion yet, or anyone has the crystal ball that it'll be 3 or 5 years or 1 year or 6 months. And that's the point, that if there is one industry that the government has to bite the bullet on and say, yes, we need to make sure that there's certainty here. We have to support this industry, support the workers, support the companies in it so it's ready to go. It's aviation. And, you know, of course it sounds difficult if you put the time horizon out to 3 and 5 years, but we've no way of knowing that. What's needed right at the moment is an incremental approach, an approach that says, yes, for the next period of time, we're going to make sure there's certainty in place. And of course, as the government has been doing up to this point, it can reassess that as the weeks and months tick by. But this is critical, Tom. This is critical for Australian families in aviation, in tourism, and for the rest of the Australian economy.
Well, even if the time frame's only a couple of years, and again, we don't know, how big it is when it does start up again. So what's the worker going to do if they're part of the international arm of an airline and they're part of this wage keeper, a JobKeeper subsidy, a wage subsidy? What are they doing in that time? Are they just sitting there literally waiting for it to restart, doing nothing, rather than, and there could be retraining. There's the alternative.
Well, retraining is important. Of course, making sure that workers are feeling that they're doing a fruitful job for the economy is important. But perhaps more important than all of that is to make sure that this industry doesn't crumble. And if you don't have an aviation sector that's ready and willing to fire again, then you will have a circumstance where it's not just those aviation workers and their families that suffer, but the entire Australian economy. Tom, we are an island economy, and we are going to rely on the government making the right decision here. It needs to put Aviation Keeper in place to support all Australians.
You've mentioned it needs to be ready to go. If international travel starts again, every indication is that would be pretty slowly. Why can't an airline slowly ramp up its capacity and hire people from an economy that will still have surplus workers?
Well, it's a nice theory, and of course there'll be lots of economists out there who will be pointing to the market and saying that the market should take care of this. But the market in aviation is broken, it's crippled, and it is craving now the federal government to step up. What the federal government really needs to do, Tom, to be quite frank, is to start taking financial stakes in aviation companies, because these types of crises are not unsurprising. They happen every few years in aviation, and when they do, aviation companies have to come cap in hand to the Australian government and therefore to the Australian taxpayer to bail them out. What's needed is more sustainability, stability, and the Australian government needs to rethink here. It needs an aviation plan, Tom, and the first step of that plan is to make sure...
If you have a plan, though, that means airlines can at least have enough staff to run a reasonable-sized domestic operation, and then they can ramp up internationally down the track under their own steam. I still don't understand why that's not possible. You said that's good in theory. What's wrong with the theory? What's wrong with it in practice?
Well, these are highly skilled workers. They're not only skilled, but the job that they do relies on extensive experience. You don't just... not suggesting you're suggesting this, Tom, but you don't just click your fingers and attract people back to an industry. Once an industry like aviation crumbles, as was shown in Ansett, it can take decades to get back to a reasonable position again. That's not what we need as an Australian economy, and the government should step in and put this in place.
We'd just attract them again with some of the highest wages in the world, though, wouldn't we? We'd be able to get workers.
Well, no, that's not the way it works. What happens here is that this is a sector that's critical. It's a sector that's full of skilled workers. It's a sector that relies on that experience, that connection with the workplace, the very thing that the Prime Minister said was so critical to ensure our economy was ready to go again. That's what this sector relies on. But not only this sector, Tom, as you know, hundreds and thousands of workers across Australia rely on it being ready to go, and that's why the government needs to act.
If you're talking about a highly skilled worker, it's hard to imagine them sticking around for $1,500 a fortnight, so presumably it's government money, it's a fair bit of money from the airlines, and as we know, they don't really have it at the moment either. So would it really be a solution for these people to be sitting around on JobKeeper for 2 or 3 years?
Well, ultimately, the question that we have to ask ourselves as a community is, what are we going to do if the aviation industry crumbles? And what we're going to do is we're going to see a deeper recession. We're going to see more Australian families struggling and suffering. And that's the decision that really faces Scott Morrison and the Treasurer as they think about this recalibration. Aviation is critical. Aviation Keeper extended to the rest of the industry to make sure all of those ancillary companies too, like catering and ground handling companies, are ready to go. It's absolutely essential. And that's why you've seen, Tom, all of these companies sign on to this open letter, because they know that this is a moment in time where it can be stability or it can be chaos and dislocation for years, and we choose stability and supporting Australian families every time.
Michael Kaine, thanks for your time today.